Hello, and welcome to the Gang Culture Podcast, a series educating you about gang culture. This season, we hope to expand on the lived experiences of gang and street life, explore further research surrounding the appeal of gangs, all while bringing together an array of unique voices to inspire, empower, and cause change. Whether you are listening at home, school, or on the way to work, we hope you enjoy and learn something that can be shared with others. Hello, welcome to Gang Culture. I'm your host, Ellis Rouse, and I am here with a special guest, Traci Murphy. Traci, hello, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm honored to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So if you can just introduce yourself to the audience and who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name's Traci Murphy, and I'm the executive director of a statewide not-for-profit organization called the Coalition for a Safer Delaware. And our primary objective is to advocate for and pass gun violence prevention policies that then we make sure are implemented effectively so they're producing the desired outcomes, which is to drive down rates of gun violence in our homes, in our schools, our neighborhoods, our communities, and really our whole state. And so in doing that, we seek to build the safer Delaware that our kids, my kids, your kids, all the kids deserve to grow up in and to come home to.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing and thank you for doing that. What are some of the key milestones the Coalition for Safer Delaware has achieved?
Gosh, that's a great question. It's a long and arduous road to see outcomes in gun violence, right? A firearm that was sold legally in 2012 might end up on the underground market in 2015 and used in a shooting in 2018, and that person might not be on trial until 2020. So it takes a long time to see the effects of our work, which can be very frustrating. But some of the key milestones we've achieved recently are, first, broadening the scope of the people who listen to us and who follow us and who hear us when we talk about ways to prevent gun violence in our homes and communities. In the past handful of years, we've passed 23 pieces of legislation at the state level, which is fundamental. We've worked at the county level and the city level on ordinances and other accomplishments. And during the previous federal administration, we saw the first federal action on gun violence prevention in 30 years, all of which happens because of the power of the people in communities raising their voices and saying, we need you to do more.
That's amazing. You talked about those laws. That's fantastic. So how can laws that address gun violence in Delaware also have an impact on public safety regarding gang violence?
The way that laws work can be very complicated. Think about traffic laws, right? When we drive our cars, we don't just have one traffic law that we have to follow. We have scores of laws that are required for people to pay attention to when they're behind the wheel. Everything from stopping when the stop sign arm of the school bus comes out, to not crossing the double yellow lines, to putting on your turn signals. But those laws don't just impact the driver when they're behind the wheel. They also impact the driver when they're being trained. And they, in fact, impact drivers all the way back to when cars are being built. And so policy work happens way before a firearm makes its way into a community, right? And so the way that laws interact with communities and community violence in particular can be really complicated. But the way we sort of break it down is that we want to make sure that firearms stay out of dangerous hands. And we know that gun violence happens at the intersection of impulse and access. And so if we can remove access to firearms during times of impulsivity, then we know we will have better outcomes when it comes to gun violence in homes, in communities, and beyond.
Yes, yeah, I agree. How has your perspective on gun violence prevention evolved over the years?
I think when I first got into doing this work, I thought it was easy. I thought, just change a law and no one will be able to buy a gun and we'll have solved the problem. And of course, what you learn when you do this work at this level is that the root causes of gun violence are so much harder to solve than the gun violence itself, right? Gun violence solutions, while they're not easy to enact, can be as simple as removing a gun from a dangerous person, right? But the root cause work, educational outcomes, housing insecurity, poverty in communities, all of those root causes lead to gun violence in communities. And the root cause work takes a much broader investment and a much broader commitment to change. Because, right, if we talked earlier, if gun violence takes a decade to see the effects of an impact, it takes generations for root cause work. So you have to have leaders, people in power who are really willing to commit in the long term. And we live in a world with elections every 2 and 4 years. And so sometimes those leaders change and you have to kind of regroup and start from scratch in some ways. So I think that's the one area where my perspective really shifted, is really understanding the complexity of the problem and recognizing that if it was easy, it would have been solved already.
Yes, yeah. So gun violence often intersects with gang culture. How do you see the coalition's work impacting gun violence related to gangs?
I think some of the hardest work we do is involved with people who are so committed to perpetuating the gun violence culture. In the movement, that's the hardest work, and our organization doesn't specifically do that work. If you look at the safest states in the country, they have 3 things in common. They have really strong laws that exist to keep guns out of dangerous hands in the first place by maybe raising the minimum age. We know that children's brains mature, and between the ages of 18 to 21, there's a lot of maturity to be gained. Raising the minimum age to 21 prevents gun violence. Access to rural services can mean suicide prevention. And similarly, in communities, and when we talk about community violence, access to services and policies and laws, all of those things make a difference. But that's not the only thing. The second lane is strong communities that understand prevention education, that have had investments in spreading the word about gun violence prevention, a lot like what we're doing right now, talking about this, bringing awareness to this topic. And finally, and most expensively, they have well-funded, well-run community violence intervention programs. That's something that Delaware is starting to do and has been doing a better job of over the last handful of years. There's a wonderful program called GVI, which is Group Violence Intervention. And
I'm familiar.
Yeah, the GVI team does incredible work with their Leaders in Training program on really creating alternatives for people, and it's often young people, who are embroiled in the gang culture, and offering them an off-ramp. So often people fall into a gang culture or a group violence culture because they feel like they have no alternative. And so by unveiling those alternatives and investing in those solutions, we are investing in gun violence prevention. So I think our work is in some ways lifting up the good work that's being done in interventions, but also advancing policies that make it harder for guns to find their way to the streets. Yeah. We talk a lot about how easy it is to buy a handgun in Delaware. Right now, you walk into a gun store and it's easy to find which ones don't card you that hard online. And you walk in and you buy a handgun, and you can drive not too many miles away and sell it for more money than you paid. It's a quick way to make money. And if you don't have a record, and if you're not a person prohibited, you can buy a firearm legally in about a half hour in our state, and you can do that all day long. We don't track who's buying firearms. We don't track what happens to them after they're purchased. And we don't track how many you buy. So if you come into a tax refund, and that's happening right now, I looked at the data before I came here today, 10% more firearms were sold in our state in March than in February. Wow. It's tax refund season. People come into money, they turn it into profit by buying firearms and selling them. And that's how guns find their way to the illegal market, and that's how people who shouldn't have them get their hands on them. And we don't get to decide how people choose to live their lives, right? We haven't given people good enough alternatives. Of course they're going to turn to crime.
Right. I did want to go back to something you mentioned as far as prevention program, GVI. I've actually worked with GVI, and it's an excellent program. And I would do a skit called The Voice of Redemption, where I would talk to young men and women that had some trouble with gang culture and stuff like that. So yeah, prevention is out there.
But I think GVI is less prevention and more intervention, right? GVI is working with a population of, I'm going to say kids, right? It's mostly young people, far younger than I am. But GVI is working with a population that is already involved. They are already identified or on the path to being identified. They're already on the ramp to the highway. Prevention happens so far before that point. And you can't prioritize one over the other. You can't say prevention is where all the investments go, because you're leaving 2 generations of intervention on the table, right? And it comes down sometimes to priorities and budget for governments, but not-for-profit organizations like this one, like yours, like so many other groups are out there doing really important intervention work at every level. Prevention happens, so many yesterdays ago. And so some of the policy work we do is designed to fill in those gaps, right? If it was easy 5 years ago for someone to buy a firearm legally, and that firearm finds its way to the underground market because it gets lost or stolen or sold or what have you, what's happening in the interim? And so that's where sometimes the policy work comes into play. But you can't win at a gun violence solution if you don't have all 3 of those concurrent lanes. You have to have policy, you have to have prevention and services, and you have to have robust community intervention programs. All 3 must exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. How do you think some of the firearm laws in Delaware could help reduce gang-related violence?
I think that the single most important law that we have worked on in the past decade is the permit to purchase law. Some states call it firearm purchaser licensing. In Delaware, we call it permit to purchase, and we passed this law just about a year ago, and it was signed into law last May. It has an 18-month stand-up period, which means we signed the law last May. It won't go into effect until this coming October. And what that law does is requires a comprehensive criminal background check and the fingerprinting that goes along with that, and a training program before someone can legally buy a handgun in Delaware. I already talked about how currently you can buy a handgun with about a half hour and a clean record. Or an ID that says you're a person with a clean record, right? But if we have a comprehensive criminal background check, that ID has to match your fingerprints. That ID has to say you are who you say you are. That's the first thing we're going to do. The second is requiring training, including live fire training, to make sure people know how to handle the deadly weapon they've purchased. And then finally, we will require an in-person appearance before law enforcement. In some ways, this policy mirrors driver's licenses, right? You practice behind the wheel, You get your white slip and your blue slip. You go to the DMV. You appear in person, and you say you are who you say you are, and they give you an ID. You show them your birth certificate to show that you are worthy of the license that you're claiming to grab onto, right? It's a very similar process. And we hear a lot of times that driving isn't protected in the Constitution. And so that's why you can create policies that protect drivers, but you can't create policies that protect citizens from firearms. The Supreme Court differs. The Supreme Court recently has continually upheld firearm safety regulations and said that the Second Amendment, in fact, does cover certain regulations. And the permit to purchase law, in fact, a similar law in Maryland went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied to hear it. So we know that this law is constitutional. And when it goes into effect, we are eager to see what that does to the amount of handguns that are so easily flooding the underground market right now. Because we know that we can do more to make sure that firearm purchasers are, in fact, who they say they are. And if we create a process like this and implement it with fidelity, we believe, and data bears out, that fewer guns will be circulated. And then if fewer guns are circulated, there's fewer instances of gang violence. We just see it play out in every other state or city that has these laws. Camden, New Jersey. I mean, you and I are both from this broader area, right? Think about the Camden we used to know and what Camden is like now because of investments, including GVI, including violence intervention programs, but also policy investments, which have done have had a huge impact on gang violence in that city. And we believe we'll see those outcomes in Delaware when this law is fully implemented.
That's great that you guys are looking to get a more streamlined process and a more strict process. What message would you like to share to the young people on the topic of gun and gang violence?
Gosh, how long is your show? I have so many messages I'd like to share, but I think the first one is that it is not the job of young people to keep themselves safe from gun violence. It is the job of the adults in their lives. Children are not legally allowed to own firearms, and they should never access them in an unsupervised way with a trusted adult. It is the job of adults to keep children safe from gun violence. And every child that has been impacted by gun violence is someone that we have failed. There's no such thing as other people's children. It is the job of every adult in our communities to keep every child safe. And so to the children who have been impacted or are impacted now, it's not your fault. We failed you, and we're doing our best in the movement to help make reparations to that outcome, but it is not your fault. And it's really important that children understand that they have been failed by a system and by the adults in their lives who have neglected to protect them. On the other hand, children have a role to play in choosing to not get involved with firearms, in choosing to direct their outcomes in a different way. And I think the earlier in childhood that we start to talk to kids like the adults they are becoming, the better those outcomes are. It used to be growing up that certain topics were never discussed with children. But actually what we found through data is that the earlier you discuss, I'm not saying talk about this with 5-year-olds in kindergarten, although we are absolutely asking 5-year-olds to hide under their desks and telling them someone's coming into their school. We are absolutely doing that, which we shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. But I think that the broader conversations should be happening at every level because children know about guns way earlier than we think they do. They are so smart, and their brains are so pliable, and they are learning so quickly that, in fact, I think if you're ever going to have a hope of preventing gun violence, you have to start those conversations with young people. Old people are set in their ways. You're not going to change them. You got to have the conversations with the kids.
Yeah. So going back to prevention. Yeah.
Right, because if we failed to prevent it, then we have no choice but to do intervention. Which is far more expensive and far more dangerous, frankly. If we succeed fully at prevention, we'll never have to worry about funding intervention. But in the real world where we live and operate, we have to do both.
Yeah.
And we cannot stop. We cannot take our foot off the gas. Guns are the leading cause of death for American children and teens. It is unconscionable that we have allowed this to happen. It is unconscionable. And so much more can be done. And I think, by the way, if you go back and look at all the conversation we've had so far, you've never one time heard me say, we have to take away all the guns. Because that is not the answer. However, we have to do more to keep those guns out of dangerous hands. And I will fight for that reality every day.
Yeah, and thank you for that. You talked about the community. So what role does the community engagement play in both prevention and breaking the cycle of violence here in Wilmington?
You know, the community, I think it's so often when we talk about a public health crisis, which gun violence very much is, we say that the community has to solve it. No, they don't. The community it is not their job to solve a public health crisis. You need bridges built into government, into the business sector, into transportation. There needs to be solutions identified at every level of municipal government, city, county, state, neighborhoods, civic associations. Everyone is responsible for the outcomes of its citizens when something is a public health crisis. And so I think that we have typically said the community needs to do it. However, the community has to inform what's happening. And one of the challenges in working in a nonprofit that's government facing is that everybody, right, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. Government thinks every solution is a government solution. Communities think, well, the government solutions haven't helped so far. Maybe we need only community solutions. The answer is we need both. And we need bridges built from all of those different levels of structure and society so that people can more easily go between community work and government work and not-for-profit work and work together on community-informed solutions.
Yeah.
And by the way, that'll look different in every community because every community is different.
Yep. Yes. Yep. So you mentioned public health crisis. So gun violence as a public health crisis is GV a public health crisis? Gun violence.
I think it is, and Delaware thinks it is. Right? We've passed resolutions, we've had proclamations signed that say yes. In fact, Delaware's gun violence crisis is a public health crisis. When I think back to times that Delaware has been a leader in public health, I think back to when we first banned cigarette smoking indoors. Delaware was the first state in the nation to do that. And the kids involved in this program and the kids, all the kids in schools now, they've never lived in a world where you could smoke indoors in our state. That's a public health solution to a public health crisis, right? And boy, did people get angry about it. You're telling me I can't smoke in restaurants and bars? I bet the kids listening to this show don't know that there used to be a time you could go on an airplane and get the smoking section or not smoking section. Can you imagine? I mean, one single room. And there was a belief that one section was separated by another. That's not real. But what it took was public outcry to make that change. And so when we look at public health solutions, we know that they can't just simply be based in the community. You need to have laws passed and implemented effectively in order to create solutions at that level.
Yeah. Is gun violence a solvable problem? What solutions exist?
Gosh, I think gun violence is a solvable problem when everyone involved in the ecosystem is committed to solving it. There's a really new ad campaign in the movement to end gun violence right now called Agree to Agree. And it's based on the fundamental principle that when we are in an argument with someone, right? I believe there should be, somebody might say teachers should be armed, and I'm saying no, teachers shouldn't be armed. There's no data to support arming teachers. And in fact, when guns are in schools, we find that more accidents are likely to happen. And so teachers should not be armed. And someone says, well, we have to agree to disagree. That sort of shuts down that conversation. If we frame that differently and we say, well, we need to agree, then the person I'm involved in the conversation with, we have to come up with a solution together, a mutual agreeable solution. And so when we agree to agree, absolutely, solutions exist. But solutions don't exist if people don't come to the table and are not willing and are willing, they need to be willing to negotiate. They need to be willing to compromise. And one of my favorite parts about working in the movement to end gun violence is working with young people, because young people don't compromise. They don't have to. They are rigid in their thinking. They know that there's a future they want to grab onto and invest in, and they are not willing to compromise. And so I think that's why it's really important to engage young people in these community conversations. We are building their future. They need to have a seat at the table every time. And it's why groups like March for Our Lives and Sandy Hook Promise, Youth Council, Students Demand Action, and groups like The Cause and student organizers have really made an impact in the movement. Because if they don't have a seat at the table, their voices aren't being heard. And they're the ones who are saying, absolutely not. I will not compromise on my safety. So you are the adults in the room. You figure it out. And that's our job.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So what should Delaware do to limit gun violence or eliminate gun violence?
I think this goes back to sort of where we need to see our investments, right? When we think about government solutions, it sort of happens in two lanes. Government has the ability, governments work with a legislature, right? They're the elected representatives of the people, and they are elected to pass and inform laws and inform the work of government on behalf of the people that elect them. So, first is laws, right? One thing Delaware can do is make sure that their laws are watertight and that they build a safety, that they weave together gun violence prevention policy into a safety net that no one can fall through, that kids cannot fall through the cracks. And how many times do we hear that, right? Oh, that's just another kid that fell through the cracks. Why are there cracks? Get rid of the cracks, right? That to me is the job of government. The other part of the job of government is to take the money that the citizens give it in our taxes and figure out how to allocate that for the greater good. And so we can, as advocates in the space, inform both the creation of those policies and how those dollars are spent to address it. That, to me, is the responsibility of the citizens. And so the most important thing we teach in schools should be to prepare young people to take part in that zeitgeist by voting. At the very least, we should be voting. We should be talking to kids about how to get informed on who they're electing so that they make sure that the people representing them are, in fact, qualified to do so. And then the very next thing is how to advocate. And I didn't start to do advocacy work until I was a mom, when I wanted to start to advocate on behalf of my kids. Well, kids today are way smarter than I was. They're advocating for themselves already. And, to me, I think we just got to stand back and let them have it. They're doing a great job.
I agree. So final question for you, Traci. How can individual people do more to prevent gun violence?
Oh, gosh. The first thing they can do is make sure that any firearms in their sphere, in their home, in their family life, and beyond, are handled appropriately. Delaware passed a secure storage law. Some states call it a CAP, or a child access prevention law. We really want to make sure that children are not engaging with firearms. And the best way to do that is to make sure that secure storage practices are being followed all the time. Something that's a little newer on the scene is a program called ASK, A-S-K, which stands for Asking Saves Kids. Something that parents can do, I already mentioned, right? It's the job of adults to keep kids safe from gun violence. But Parents should always be asking about the presence of firearms where their children visit or play. And I'm talking spring break at grandma's house, Thanksgiving dinner at your aunt's house, a backyard barbecue where you go into the house to use the restroom. Children should never be able to access firearms. And it is the glory of childhood is curiosity. It's not our job as adults to tell kids to not be curious. It's our job to make sure their world is safe for them to explore. So those are two things right away that everyone can do. Ask and make sure that firearms in your sphere are locked up appropriately, and always, always ask about the presence of firearms where your children are. Those are sort of the easiest lifts. If people need firearm gun locks or funding for a gun safe, they can call our organization. We have a fund for that. We will send gun locks free of charge. I have probably 75 of them in my trunk right outside. I don't leave the house without gun locks anymore. It's an unusual thing for a suburban minivan mom to be driving around with. But I think that the more we normalize conversations around gun safety, the more people see a gun lock on a table at a community fair, the more people will realize, yeah, there's guns everywhere in our country, but we can do more to keep ourselves safe from bad outcomes that firearms can produce.
Well, Traci, I thank you so much for your insight and all your efforts.
Thank you.
The community needs more of Traci's, and just thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. I have been really enjoying my connection with this group and this organization, and I feel like, as I said earlier, right, all of the hope for the future lies in the kids that are doing this hard work today. So thank you for including me.
Thank you. We hope you found this episode informative. I look forward to continuing the conversation next week on gang culture. Stay tuned as we dive into an enlightening conversation with our guests.